Africa Prime, brought to you by Jamison's Select Reserve.
Welcome back to Africa Prime. From Nairobi, we'll be joined by Stephen Oundo. He's chairman of the Kenya Architects Association. And here in Johannesburg, we're joined by Sithole Mbanga. He is CEO of the South African Cities Network. Let me begin with you, Sithole, by talking about the issue around managing the cities for growth and finding the money to grow those cities so that the plans that we know are being put in place are actually implemented. We, earlier on before you joined us, I had a discussion with Kobe Brand. She's with ICLEI, their local government association. They group 1,300 cities across the world. And she talked about one of the problems being implementation. So let's begin. From a funding perspective, is the money available to fund the growth that we're seeing across African cities as the continent has been recognized as one of the fastest growing regions in the world?
No, thanks very much for having me. Yes, there is money available. It is located in various pockets. Some of it is very much in the public sector. Some of it is in the private sector. But I think possibly the most hidden one, which is also potential, is within citizens themselves.
Right.
Money that you will find in the public sector, you will, I think, normally in any country go to your treasury, yeah, and they will have instruments for funding of cities. Right. In the South African context, we have been debating, for instance, something called the Large Cities Support Program, okay, which intends to fund at least about 4 legs of city development aimed at changing infrastructure. Yeah. Money that you will find in the private sector will come through funds that are conceptualized by your finance institutions, right, who then put up those funds, almost competing with your public funds in a way, and offering this and that as option depending on the difficulty that you have to access the public funds.
Right. What is the best way of funding the city's growth? Is it the public sector? Is it the private sector? Is it a combination of the two?
I always suggest that there's no one way of doing things, so I will go with the latter and suggest that it is a combination of everything, because at any given point in time you need financial resources to fund an aspect of development, yeah, and there will be specific objectives for which a fund has been created in order, right, to fund. So I always go for the combination, but of course the trick is how do you combine sometimes contradictory objectives, right, into one, yeah, objective. Yeah. The objectives of making profit, yeah, which are primarily those that are driven by the private sector, yeah, and the objective of ordinary public good, which, yeah, is what the public sector intends or always intends.
Yeah, so we talk about the need for capacity, and that's an issue that we will try and see if we can address. Stephen, from where you sit in East Africa, do you find that we are getting more and more private money coming into this space to try and fund be it roads or be it housing for citizens of the cities in that region?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here with you. The scenario in East Africa is no different. Right now we actually have the private sector being the key driver of development, whether you're talking about housing, whether you're talking about road infrastructure. And I've always said that the private sector alone will not actualize these plans. You really have to have the element of government coming in. And whenever you're talking about an infrastructure project, you're talking about large, colossal amounts of money. And if you ever went to the Treasury and probably say that you're going to rely on the Treasury to come up with the funds for whichever project it is, whether it's road or the ports, you're always going to be told that there's a deficit and we cannot afford it. And that is why we have come up with East Africa. We're talking about especially Kigali, yeah, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, and Kampala. If you go and look at those model cities right now, they are heavily relying on public-private partner relationships. And they're talking especially about the model where you're doing build and design, or you also have build, operate, and transfer, which is essentially a scenario where a private investor is given the opportunity whether it is to put up a road or put up a housing estate,
Yeah.
they are able to retrieve their profits in advance and then thereafter pass it on to the government.
Right.
We've not seen it in completion, but at least those are the novel steps that are being taken right now to realize this within the development sector in East Africa.
Yeah. Is that something that perhaps Southern Africa could be looking at?
For sure, I think it's one of the options. I'm always skeptical when, and I think that's just a personal position. I'm always very skeptical of a situation where the private sector becomes a driver of development, particularly I think for us in the continent.
But they are more efficient, you have to say.
That's almost suggesting that the private sector is always a panacea of everything, and it's not always the case. And I'm not in any way suggesting that they do not have a role. In fact, they have a very key role, particularly when it comes to their technical ability and all of that. But I think the point that I'm making, though, is that at any given point in time, when you have an investment, whether it's private or it's public sector or otherwise driven, there's always the public money that gets to be spent in one way or the other.
Right.
Whether that public asset is land itself, whether the public asset is about putting a kilometer of road, someone is going to be left with the burden of maintaining that. And again, at the end of the day, it graduates to the public sector. So in as much as I am a skeptic, I'm also a supporter of the role of private sector.
In other words,
public
we need
sector
both to work together.
Precisely.
One of the points that was raised by Kobe when I spoke to you earlier on was the issue around welcoming the growth of African cities and actually accepting the huge numbers of Africans that are coming to the African cities. Stephen, in your region, is this the correct way of going about this? Is indeed urbanization the answer to sorting out the living conditions for the African masses?
Yeah, you see the thing about urbanization is an economic force, it's a social force. It is something either you embrace, manage and succeed, or you ignore it at your own peril. I would like to support the input of my colleague when he was talking about when you talk about infrastructure development and urbanization being totally left to the private sector. As much as the private sector is efficient, but I can tell you for sure, if government is not involved in any of these projects to some extent, then we are talking about failure at the end of the day. Because you see, the moment a project ceases to be able to give the financial returns, which the private sector is very good at, then it's going to be left. And remember, the reason why we have government is supposed to provide services irrespective of the profitability. We need the roads. We need to move from one pain to another. We need the bridges. We need housing. And housing is a good example I can give you if I take the point in Kenya. Right now, we talk about an urban housing demand of about 200,000. And the private sector, despite all its initiative and everything, is only able to do about 40,000. Government is just doing maybe about 10,000.
But so Stephen, let me raise a point here. Isn't it the issue, though, that government lacks capacity, number one? Number two, that also government funds are, as we all know, around the world, they are short and there's huge demands for them. So on the other hand, we do know that there is private money available. Isn't it an issue here of government creating the environment?
Yes. Now, let me put it this way. I just take even the housing one component I was talking about. The government should provide a very small role. I would talk about the infrastructure. Leave the building of the houses and the profitability of the houses to the private developer. There you cannot beat them. But so long as the government has not put in the roads, has not put in the sewer, the services, then it means you're going to have very little serviced land. And the multiplier effect of that is very expensive housing, because when the private developer is trying to recoup his returns, he has to factor in the high cost of land. So we have to look at it as a joint effort, each one playing their role. Let the government focus on the general services, and then the private developer can come with the innovations on the type of housing and the modules and the technology that goes with it too.
Yeah. Stola, I saw you nodding your head.
Oh yes, I think I agree quite a lot with what Stephen is saying. And I think there's obviously lessons to learn. I think for me the most important issue is to always take the principles, but the application has to be geography by geography.
Right.
Because
right.
I mean, the application is going
Okay.
to be slightly quite different. I also perhaps would like to add a nuance there and
Sure.
suggest that in certain instances you find very poor people who cannot afford. And I think we have a political responsibility to provide for the poorest of the poor, first and foremost. So on the one hand, the private sector effort is meeting the demands of those that can afford. What about the poor? And I think that's where government comes in. Of course, I think to deal with some of the shortages in what Steve is saying, I think that creativity is very important. Issues of density are quite important because you don't just build, you also build for purposes of efficiency, because that efficiency will lead to long-term sustainability.
Right.
Try to do things as efficiently as possible. The delivery of basic water, for instance, the delivery of energy, the extent to which you design, and I'm sure he's possibly more affair with the subject, in which you design in such a manner that you allow access in and out, so that you don't build in the way, like for instance, the apartheid city was built, which was trapping poverty.
Right.
So if you look in South Africa, a typical township, in fact, any part where you have had interaction with the apartheid thinking of how you build a city, the likelihood is that you're likely to find a township that has strong poverty and a suburb, a well-off suburb that has lots of access, and the township possibly has 1 or 2 entrances. It's not just a physical thing, it's also a very practical thing of access.
Yeah. Stephen, you have 20 seconds to tell me what you think ought to be done to ensure that as Africa grows and Africa urbanizes, we are building the right cities, providing the infrastructure for it.
One, Africa has one problem we've been fighting: corruption. And if you look at the failures in our development system, it's all about the element of implementation. We have very good building laws, and here we have the private sector knowing very well that the governments tend to not supervise their projects very well. They exploit those loopholes, and we end up with a scenario where the end user, which are the common one who we should be addressing, gets substandard buildings. So if we can fight corruption and enshrine professionalism, don't look at the private sector as an enemy. Look at them as one you can work with together. But each party has to play its role. Just like a football team, it doesn't matter how good your football team is. If you don't have a goalkeeper, you're going to leak. If you don't have building laws that you're following, backed up by professionals, then we're going to be in a difficult scenario.
Thanks. Stoli, your 10 seconds.
Thanks. I think that the advent of climate change, in as much as it is a huge problem, I think it has suddenly presented itself as an opportunity for us to rethink the shape, form, and function of our cities in order to accommodate all, particularly the poor. And I think there's an opportunity. Perhaps we need to sit down much more vigorously and unpack what it really means for rethinking an African city.
Stole, thanks very much indeed. If I can sum up the positions from you both, it is that we need a combination of both the private and the private sector in order to build the cities that will contain Africa's economic growth as the continent urbanizes. That was it for Africa Prime. As I said, I was talking to Stole Mpanga, he is CEO of SA Cities Network, as well as Stephen Oundo, he is chairman of the Kenya Architectural Association. And that's it for Africa Prime. I'm Godfrey Mutizwa. We'll see you next week.